Welcome to SCI-Arc. I am David Root, Chair of Postgraduate Programs. Like most of you, I'm not quite sure what to expect tonight. However, as they say in boxing, styles make fights. So I think tonight's going to be a good one. It's not an obvious meeting of minds. And as far as I know, our guests tonight have never shared a stage together. They are each at the top of their game and exert noticeable influence on contemporary architecture. But they do inhabit different ecosystems and wouldn't normally meet in the wild. Perhaps that might change after tonight. Sylvia Lavin is a professor of history and theory of architecture at Princeton University. She is also the co-director of the program in Media and Modernity. She is a historian, a theorist, an educator, and a curator. Sylvia has an uncanny and enduring ability to set the discourse table and direct the attention of architects. She has left her distinctive marks on collections, schools, and imaginations. Sylvia has on numerous occasions nearly single-handedly changed the architectural conversation, as she did recently with regard to architectural postmodernism. And I'm pretty sure she will shock the world again and again. Though Graham Harman is now a distinguished member of the SCI-Arc faculty, he has come to us from the world of philosophy. Whether that world is an outside or yet another inside might be a point of debate tonight. Since the now infamous Speculative Realism Conference at Goldsmiths College in 2007, Graham has been a primary protagonist in the complex post-continental terms of contemporary philosophy. A purveyor of, quote, conceptual surprises, these are his words, on a previous occasion. He has inspired new projects in aesthetics, politics, economics, ecological criticism, and of course, in architecture. He is astonishingly prolific and is already the author of 20 books and will soon be publishing his first book about architecture. Do all objects matter equally is the title of tonight's event. I am unsure in what sense to take this question, actually. On the one hand, it seems to be a reference to Graham's object-oriented ontology, where the human mind is no longer in a privileged ontological position. I suppose in his philosophical thesis, all objects matter equally insofar as they are all equally withdrawn from absolute understanding. On the other hand, it might also be a reference to our contemporary political discourse, where we are all wrestling with problems of equity and inclusion. As important as both of these allusions of the questions might be, a less obvious perspective, but a pertinent one at a school of design, might be the curatorial one. How do we decide, for example, which objects are the ones that are historically significant? Why did I save this photograph and not that one? Why was this painting auctioned for $12 million when this one was discarded? Why is this architectural object the one that matters? I'm just as curious as you to see how this conversation now unfolds. Please welcome Sylvia Lavin and Graham Harman.
All right, Sylvia and I agree that the prompt for this discussion would be my forthcoming book, Artful Objects, which is not to be confused with Art and Objects, a book I've already published. And so I'll talk a little about that. I want to get to David's question about the sense in which objects are equal or not equal. But I also want to talk a little here about formalism, because I'm always interested in hearing what architects think about this. And I have a different interpretation of the concept from many people. And that's also one of the main topics of my forthcoming book, Artful Objects. First, I want to say, I don't know about all of you, but I have this unofficial running list in my mind at all times of people I've heard the most about, but never met. And since I entered the architecture world, it's usually been architects on that list. So for a long time, I'd never met Tom Main, but of course he's talked about constantly at SCI-Arc. Then finally I met Tom Main. Well, Sylvia is probably at the top of my list now, and that comes to an end tonight. I finally get to meet her in a sense in the universe of Zoom. anyway, as some of you already know, Sylvia is an extraordinary writer. I've been delighting in recently in her book on Richard Neutra and psychoanalysis, Form Follows Libido. In addition to the astonishing content in this book, Sylvia is the crafter of powerful and rich sentences. It's really just a pleasure to read these sentences and see how they're strung together into a larger argument. Okay, back to the topic of Artful Objects, that book. It's a strange book. It's maybe the only book that I didn't plan and write as a book. It's simply that I was invited to Stockholm to give a pair of lectures at the Stockholm Museum of Modern Art and the Stockholm Institute of Economics. And then they decided to publish the Art Museum lecture and Q&A as a booklet. And so it's got a kind of informal style. I tried to keep it as close to the oral style as I could when editing. I want to make one other remark here before I get started. There's nothing I love better than innovations in theory. That's the thing I love most on earth. Seeing somebody try a completely new theory, even if it's in a field I don't know well yet, and imagine the possible consequences if that theory is deployed against older theories. Even so, I often find myself in the strange position of defending things that seem to be old-fashioned. So, for example, I've got all this involvement with contemporary philosophy, as David mentioned, but I'm always defending Aristotle, right? 4th century BC, who is not in fashion right now in the philosophy world. At least in the popular imagination, philosophy now has discovered that everything's in total flux. Everything is moving, constantly changing. So how can you support this middle-aged philosophy of Aristotle where there are stable individuals called substances? Well, the reason for that is that a lot of times things are overcome too quickly before all of their potential has been fully tapped. During the 1990s, I stuck with Heidegger as everyone around me was doing Derrida or Foucault, who meant less to me intellectually than Heidegger did, despite his numerous warts biographically. And tonight, I mention this because tonight I want to say something about formalism, which I would defend in a qualified sense. In visual arts and also in architecture to some extent, though it has a different meaning there. But when it comes to the arts, formalism is something that was supposedly dead and buried from the appearance of pop in the early 60s. And whereas Clement Greenberg and the still living Michael Fried, who visited us a couple of years ago here, are seen to be defending an old out-of-date tradition. I actually think there's something to be learned still from that tradition, but not with all the conclusions they draw from it. So formalism, I'll speed up a little here. It might seem like Russian formalism is a sufficiently old starting point, and we could start there, but I actually like to start with Kant's. As those of you with philosophy background already know, Kant wrote 3 great works: The Critique of Pure Reason, The Critique of Practical Reason, and The Critique of Judgments. You've got metaphysics or ontology, and then you've got ethics, and then you've got art and biology in the last one. And the only place I'm aware of where Kant uses the word formalism is in his ethics, although he's very much the godfather of formalism in the arts. What formalism and ethics means for Kant, he says ethics is autonomous, not heteronomous. That means an ethical act must be done for its own sake. If you're performing an ethical act because you want a good reputation in the community, or you want to feel good about yourself, or because you want to go to heaven and not hell, these may all be socially beneficial, but these are not strictly ethical acts. They're being done for a reason that is outside of the action itself. And actions cannot be judged by their consequences. These are typically Kantian ideas and ethics. Now, I've always been drawn to the critique of Kant's ethics by Max Scheler, a very colorful early 20th century German philosopher. And Scheler admires Kant greatly and thinks that ethics should be done for its own sake as well. It shouldn't be done for some ulterior purpose. And yet, he doesn't think ethics is something that unfolds totally on the human side. Ethics for Scheler is about what he calls an ordo amoris, a rank ordering of loves or passions that each of us has, different for each of us. Those are not beyond criticism. A person can have passion for the wrong things. You can be an ethical failure. But the basic unit of ethics for Scheler is not the human being, the autonomous human being. The basic element of ethics for Scheler is the human relation to an object, whether that be an actual physical object, a person. I'm using object in the widest sense of the term here. And this allows Scheler to say that people have individual ethical vocations, and there are even national ethical vocations, whereas for Kant, ethics is always universal. So Scheler allows some particularity in there that's fascinating. In terms of the Critique of Pure Reason, the core of Kant's philosophy, there are 2 separate worlds. There's the noumenal and the phenomenal. The phenomenal is what we experience, according to the categories of human understanding in space and time. Then there's the noumenal, the way things are in themselves, to which humans can have no access due to our finitude. We are, as it were, trapped in a human mind in these categories and the pure forms of space and time. And here there's another counterpoint. The counterpoint there would be Bruno Latour, the contemporary French philosopher, one of my favorites, who questions the very idea that there could be two worlds, nature and culture, or noumenal and phenomenal. He tends to say that everything is a hybrid. You can't really find anything in the world and say that's nature and this thing over here is culture. The ozone hole, is it natural or cultural? Well, it's kind of both. Most strawberries are genetically modified. Most dogs that we see on the street are bred by humans to be a specific breed, and so forth. You can't really draw a line between those two. But the one that concerns us here in an architectural and arts context is the critique of judgment, where he doesn't call himself a formalist, but he's very much the forefather of those who do call themselves formalists in the 20th century and beyond. Aesthetics for Kant happens on the human side of the equation. He's not that interested in the art object. He's interested in the judgments we make, which are beyond any prose summary. Taste is what allows us to make aesthetic judgments, and that you cannot give criteria for taste. You just have to make judgments of taste. And it's all unfolding on our side. And he doesn't talk so much about what most people are concerned about today, which is that formalism excludes the socio-political context, and then it becomes an elite exercise that doesn't care about human equality or emancipation. Kant doesn't talk about that issue, but if he were here today, he would say very much that he wants to exclude those things from pure judgments of beauty. This is formalism as we know it in the arts, in the way that we hear it criticized often. And Clement Greenberg and Michael Fried in the visual arts are two of the more famous formalists, along with Roger Fry, and there's some other names. But Fried takes a strange turn on this issue. Fried starts off his career as a straightforward formalist who says art should not be theatrical. He's looking at 18th century French painting and talks about how the figures in the painting are trying to give the illusion of being totally absorbed in what they are doing and therefore not paying any attention to us at all. And there are various things they do, like there can be a desk drawer opened out towards us as if to push us away. They're engaged in very painstaking activities like building houses of cards or blowing soap bubbles. These are techniques Fried sees in the 18th century because what Fried doesn't like in the art is theatricality, meaning that the painting seems to be playing to us, trying to have a theatrical effect on us. But just to summarize the rest of his career quickly, he gives that up in a hurry when he realizes that Courbet is painting himself into his own paintings, which is already breaking down the dividing line between the painting and the beholder, as he calls it, the person looking at the painting. And even more so in Manet, who he considers the pivotal artist, the first artist of modernity, because there's usually a central figure in Monet's great canvases who is turning and staring right at us. And even more than that, the whole surface of the painting seems to be there for the taking, right in front of us, rather than being painted in illusionistic three-dimensional depth. It's all there on the surface. And so even though Fried to this day continues to use theatrical as a pejorative term, he did that still when he was here, talking about contemporary art he doesn't like. In fact, within his own career, you can see that theatricality is becoming more and more central, even though he doesn't want it to be. Now, here's what I think the mistake is. People make a confusion between two roles humans play with respect to the artwork. On the one hand, you can say humans are the observers or beholders of artworks. And the important thing for formalists there is to make sure that the work of art has some autonomy, that it has a depth that cannot be exhausted by any human interpretation of it. But then there's another sense in which humans can also be ingredients of art. And this becomes very obvious in a lot of the post-1960s trends like performance art, conceptual art, happenings, and so forth. Think the kinds of art that Greenberg and Fried do not like. They will even call Joseph Beuys boring. They don't have much time for this churn in our world from the 1960s on. And so effectively, it's an argument that human participation destroys art by making it theatrical, whereas I am saying that there's no art without a beholder, and the beholder is automatically an ingredient. There is no artwork without somebody to experience it. And so therefore, it's a mistake to try to take theatricality out of art. And this is the reason, by the way, why I'm pretty sure, this is just a crazy theory I have, that the first artwork was probably a mask, not a painting. Because what's the most visceral experience you can have aesthetically? It's probably wearing a mask, seeing somebody in a mask, whether it's a masked supremacist group like the KKK, or whether it's, I managed to scare my parents' dogs with this zebra mask from Tanzania. It looked like had smoky eyes, looked like it had risen from the dead. And my parents' dogs would go crazy and almost start attacking me, even though they knew it was me. And children, you can see the effect of masks as well. In any case, my point here is that the object isn't something apart from the human. It can be. In object-oriented ontology, object has a wider sense. It can mean the object plus the person beholding it. That forms a new object. Why would I call that an object? Because your own reaction to an artwork is also something just like an object that is partly inscrutable and something that resists the first interpretation. It's sometimes very hard to figure out what your reaction is to an artwork or an architectural work. There's something real about it that exceeds your descriptive talents at any given moment. So that's one kind of object people don't usually talk about, because they like, when I say object, they're thinking about mid-sized physical things, which isn't all that I mean by object. I mean anything that cannot be reduced to its pieces or reduced upward to its effects. Undermining and overmining, as I call them. If something resists being undermined to its component pieces and resists being overmined to its effects, you've got an object on your hands. And something that needs more than just a few seconds of observation to capture the secret of. Okay, so in other words, the beholder plus the object can become autonomous, even though for Kant, something is only autonomous if it keeps the human and the non-human realms distinct. That's what autonomy is about for Kant, ultimately. You've got humans on one side and non-humans on the other. Okay, so why make the case for formalism and autonomy? Isn't this just the old elitist trap, where the great formalists in American literary criticism, the new critics, were criticized for being upscale white gentlemen, often from the South, a kind of elite clique that wasn't inclusive in the way we want to be now? Well, the reason there's a case for formalism is because there is a limit to any relationality. There's a limit to a thing's embeddedness in its context. So if somebody talks about wanting to do site-specific art or site-specific architecture, they don't mean it literally. What they mean is that there are a handful, 5 or 6 aspects of the site that they're taking into account. They're not indiscriminately absorbing all influences from the outside. You can't do that. It's impossible. There isn't this holistic cosmos where everything affects everything else. You are going to be including some things in the site and excluding other things in the site. And the elements of the site that are included are actually part of the artwork, I would say, or part of the architectural work. But then some things are not part of it. Just as I think the same mistake is made when people think that certain works of art or philosophy or literature are part of their time. Actually, oftentimes they're a counter-environment to their time. They're pushing back against the excesses of their time, and they're enclosing themselves over against the time, and they can also outlast that time and survive. And you can still watch Shakespeare in 21st century Indonesia, and it works pretty well. It's not bound to the Elizabethan era that Stephen Greenblatt thinks produced it. So there's a formalist argument to be made there. Okay. And as for political art, because I think this is going to come up, I have nothing against political art, despite the fact that most formalistically inclined people do. It's just that somehow political art needs to be more than political content, or it's not art. And the most disappointing example I remember going to an art biennale within the last 10 years, and literally every work in the show was either telling us that the United States is bad or Israel is bad. Those are the only two kinds of work in the show. Imagine an opposite show, a right-wing show, where every work is either the United States is good or Israel is good. You might prefer one or the other, depending on your politics, but the aesthetic failing is the same in both cases. The artwork is being used as a vehicle for prose content. And in that case, why not just write a treatise? Or why not write a letter to the editor? Why try to package it as art? Okay, now I just want to say one last thing about architecture here, just to throw it out there to maybe provoke some questions. As you may know, if you've read Kant's Critique of Judgment, he's not a big fan of architecture. It does not rank high on his list of art forms. And the reason is simply that it has a use. And for Kant, as soon as something beautiful has a use, it's been contaminated with the human element and has lost its aesthetic purity. And this is why architecture ranks very low. Not as low for him as for Schopenhauer, who says it's lower than water fountains, but still pretty low for Kant. And every period of philosophy usually takes one genre of art as exemplary. For Aristotle, it's tragedy. For Kant, it's literature. For Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, it's music. It may turn out that architecture leads the way now. And the reason for that is because architecture is forced to work against Kant's aesthetics, which is the great classic work of aesthetics in the last few centuries, the thing we have to push back against if we want to innovate. Architecture is forced to not accept what Kant says about the status of architecture. It is forced to find some way in which what he calls use can be aestheticized or autonomized and made independent of a particular use. And I'm writing about this in my recently finished book on architecture, which I'm having a few people check through right now before it gets published. And I just wanted to say, here's my last comment. Oftentimes when I hear architects or people in the architecture world talk about form and function, that famous old distinction, I'm not happy with the way that either of them is defined. Form tends to be identified with the visual look of a building and the function with the use. The problem with both of these for me is that both of these are purely relational. The visual look is a visual look for somebody. It's not a deep form. Whereas in the Middle Ages, the scholastic philosophers talked about the substantial form, which is a form deeper than anything that can be seen of it. It's something you have to get at indirectly, like in most aesthetics. Most aesthetics is an indirect detection or allusion to something. And so something has to be done to reconsider what that concept form might mean. And I've already mentioned function, how that might have to be rethought. So I think we need to derelationize these terms somehow, make them deeper, and talk about new ways of expressing them and alluding to them. And with that, I will stop, and maybe we'll get to David's questions as well, but I want to hear what Sylvia has to say first.
I just want to begin by thanking David for the super generous and completely uncalled for introduction, and to thank SCI-Arc for inviting me and for hosting this conversation, although I now suddenly feel as though our timing is a bit off and we probably should have had this conversation once your next book is published, since, for various reasons, that sounds like it will be a difficult, a different but interesting conversation. So I thought I would just start off by saying that I was very graciously sent by Graham the manuscript for this little book, Artful Objects. And it's a terrific book that I hope you all get a chance to read soon. And one of the reasons that it's such a joy to read is because it states its purpose very simply and very directly up front. The book concerns less objects as such, as I understood it, than the art object in particular, a special category of object that, if I understood Graham's argument, is at risk of being undermined by undue attention to the conditions under which works of art are made or to the channels through which they circulate. Graham's goal then in this short book is to redirect attention to the works themselves. Now, just because I need eye candy to think, I would like to share my screen. Okay, so this is in fact Graham in the action of redirecting attention to the work themselves. And it's quite wonderful that in this image of his interventions in Stockholm, the audience and the stage is populated by what I take to be instantiations of these artful objects. Now, while this goal is simple enough, this redirection of attention, the path towards these artful objects, again, as I understand the argument, is complicated by the fact that one of the characteristics of this special kind of object, the art object, is that it can only be approached indirectly. Graham uses the black hole as an example of such an object. And I suppose I show this image from the Black Hole Initiative at Harvard, where they have fabricated an image of the unseeable object to just put on the table, maybe to begin to raise some questions about this idea of indirection, since apparently now we have a new form of seeing that is more or less direct, I suppose. Now, I want to add that while Graham does not state the following in the current book, although he may in the next one, the architectural object has often been considered to be especially elusive and retiring, the characteristic of art objects in this argument. And I give you just one silly example of an undecidedly architectural object, one that seems to amplify both the general weaknesses of being reduced to basic transactional considerations, as well as the specific forms of pretension that Graham suggests are necessary to describing things indirectly. What you're looking at here is Peter Eisenman's reduction of House 1 to its monad, I suppose, which is this this cube. And I don't know whether this is undermining or overmining, but it is certainly a characteristically undecidable architectural object that I would say stands in very well for this problem of indirection. Now, I would like to suggest maybe that it's this strange nature of the architectural object that is both more and less than the art object, as I understood Graham's definition of it to be, that explains another feature, not of the architectural object, but of the architectural discipline, or that's a complicated word, which we can discuss, but the fact that historically architecture is rather hospitable. And I would say this evening is one such example of this hospitality. I could go farther and say that, like Blanche Dubois, we might even say that architecture has always depended on the kindness of strangers, whether those strangers are patrons, unknown users of the future, and philosophers, all of whom have been known to accept architecture's invitation by bringing to the table offerings of indirect description of what does and does not belong to the architectural domain. I cite one sentence from Graham's book. If an architect invites me to speak, usually the first thing I say is, don't expect me to provide any ideas about how to construct buildings because I have no idea. Now, perhaps we can circle around and end up back to this interesting question, since presumably an architect would not want construction suggestions from a philosopher, but also to say that perhaps the question that interests me the most is not to be asked of Graham, but of the architects in the room, which is just what is it that you want from philosophy? So to get us there, I thought we could just work through some sort of thought experiments about your thinking and work from the artful object to the architectural object in the following way. Since your three tables is such an important model of your thought, I thought we could do a switcheroo and look at three chairs. And I guess I would like to ask you, do you think this is doing artwork or philosophical work? And could you help us understand the difference?
This would be artwork, I would say, rather than philosophical work. And the reason is there's a kind of deliberate opacity of the examples. In philosophy, at least the way it's usually done, I don't agree with this. The way philosophy is usually done as a theoretical enterprise is to make true prose statements about the world. There have been a handful of philosophers in history who I think have a real aesthetic talent that goes beyond that. Plato, Nietzsche, Bergson, maybe Giordano Bruno as a fourth, and Hegel in certain passages, who are able to understand the power of suggestion and not simply reduce a thing to a true prose statement about the world. In Kossuth's case, there's the definition of the chair, the photograph of the chair, and the chair itself. I think there's more aesthetic work being done there. He's somehow taking the chair and detaching it from its physical underpinning by putting it in three different media. There's the verbal medium, the photographic medium, and the physical medium. So it turns the chair into a kind of ghost, stops it from being just a material object. In the difference between this example and my example of the three tables is that for me, there's actually one physical table that can be interpreted in three different ways rather than three images. So there's the table, there's the table that we know that's made of parts, made of atoms, and to only talk about that is the undermining. Then there's the table as something practically useful that we put in our office or can put things on top of, or cats can jump on. That to reduce the table to its uses would be overmining. And then the real table has to be something in between those two, right? Because the table is something more than its parts, and it's also something less than its uses because it has many more possible uses that no one has ever dreamed of. And so there is something in common with this Kossuth work, although Kossuth himself is actually fairly harsh about the kind of philosophy I'm doing in advance. Kossuth has a specific interpretation of Wittgenstein and thinks that this is how art should be done, right? And the traditional kind of art is somehow dead. It's a pretty aggressive essay that he wrote when he was young. I mean, I've talked too much already. What's your thought about Kossuth?
Well, I was curious what you thought about it, in part because his reception in the art world was complicated by the fact that he often said that what he was doing was philosophy. So there are, differences of opinion about what the nature of a philosophical proposition is. And I just thought it would be interesting to hear you think about it. Along the same lines, I want to show you one other object in three different forms, I suppose, and just to see if we go from art philosophy, indeterminacy, what happens when we go to architecture. Mm-hmm. So now that you've met Tom Main, we can talk about Tom's early work. I suppose this is undermining in some way the reduction of something to its component parts. Quite literally here, the reduction of a house to its parts. Perhaps an image, this is the same thing, overmining. This kind of, the reading that such an image would authorize has a whole lot to do with its content and context and transaction and building codes and circulation and all of those sorts of things. So, and then this perhaps one might say is in between. I wonder whether you think of any one of these things as the object, or are they all three objects? How would you think about the relationship between these three versions of the same thing?
I would say these are all objects, but the object we're talking about, the architectural work, is not commensurable entirely with any of these. It's a kind of ghost. It's something that's real, but it's what I call the substantial form. It's something that is by definition incommensurable with any attempt to prosify it, to put it in direct prose terms or in any direct image. It's something behind all of those. And in terms of undermining, I got the chance to see Rem Koolhaas's Biennale in Venice, where it was all the elements of architecture in each different room. And I thought it was pedagogically interesting. I don't think it really gave us a sense of what architecture was about, but it got me thinking about the role played by each element. And there's a value to that, just like there's a value in explaining everything in the world in terms of the periodic table of chemistry. It doesn't mean that it gives an accurate picture of the world, but it's nice to know what the underlying elements are. And then you can start thinking combinatorially about how they work together. And also, as for the building codes and so forth, yes, you have to meet those. But I have the same remark about that I have about trying to politicize everything, which is that everything exists in a socio-political environment, but it also is partly withdrawn from that environment and partly is robust to changes in that environment. So you have buildings, famous buildings that have been in many different countries over the course of history, with totally different civilizations. Think about Istanbul and all the different civilizations that Hagia Sophia has been a part of. And now it's back to a mosque again, right? People are praying there. So the building itself is something, I wouldn't say over and above, I'd say under and beneath all those various incarnations.
So you just said that you were at Rem's Biennale and you didn't think it was about architecture, that it explained certain things, but it didn't tell you much about architecture. I suppose I would ask you, just how is it that you know an artwork is an artwork when you see one? And I would ask you that in relation to this image for a couple of reasons. One, because of course, very famously, pornography is perhaps the only thing that approximates your definition of art in a legal context. I can't define what pornography is, but I know it when I see it. But also, this particular work was described exactly as not art, but as pornography by Rosalind Krauss when it was first published in Artform, where she was the house critic at that moment. So it was in a battle over whether or not the art community could agree on whether this was art or not that founded October magazine and the continuation of the formalism that you just described, because Rosalind's assertion was this was not art. She quit, and a very significant shift in American art historical practice happened. So Krauss could not recognize this as art when she saw it. I wonder about your sense of confidence that you know it when you see it.
Art, for me, is a deliteralized experience. It's one in which the real object withdraws behind its surface qualities, which is not what happens in literal experience. In literal experience, we tend to identify a thing with all the qualities it's showing. In the artwork, there has to be a certain je ne sais quoi that is not adequately expressed by its qualities. So a kind of rift has to be created between the object and its qualities. As for this particular work, the standard formalist response to this, I think, like Greenberg, if he were here, would say, this is a shock to social mores. It's not a shock to aesthetic tastes. So he would say it's not an artwork. But then there is some pornography that we would be inclined to call arts, right? There's the Empire of the Senses, is that what the film is called? And there's, I like Bataille's Story of the Eye, which is a flat out pornographic novel, but it's done with some real literary skill. It makes it a kind of magical book. And no one ever wants to be on the side of saying certain things aren't arts, right? That makes you look like a cigar-smoking bourgeois who, and they've linked that artwork Coffee Time. People who call that not an artwork are much more likely to support Trump. I don't know if you've seen that article. That's a much better predictor of support for Trump than college degrees are. Whether you think this very abstract crayon piece is art or not. So the people who say that it is arts are going to be voting for Biden, and the people who say it's not are going to be voting for Trump. And so no intellectual wants to get caught dead on the side of saying something not art. I can't say I'm especially moved by this image, because it looks to me like something that is initiating a social shock more than it is creating a tension between the object and its qualities. Then an interesting exercise for me would be, what's the smallest number of changes I could make to this to convince myself that it's art? And I'm not sure maybe get rid of the sunglasses would be the first thing, because that makes it seem kind of like snarky provocation more than art. These are just my own opinions. I don't know. I'd have to sit down and think about it. I could probably find 4 or 5 changes that would be sufficient to have me consider it an artwork, whether a good one or not. So I don't know what Rosalind Krauss's reasons were in this case. I don't agree with her on everything. I agree with her on some things.
Well, again, these are just thought experiments. I sort of wondered how long it would take us to get to the je ne sais quoi. It was a little bit sooner than I thought.
Right.
In any case, I would say, speaking historically, this was first received not as art. The sense of expectation has shifted, and it has moved slowly from the not art to art for many people, although perhaps not for you. So I suppose my next question to you is a little bit along the lines of what you were just doing. What does it take to make something into art? Does it take a change to the object, or does it require argument, a new kind of argument, or, to borrow some of the vocabulary that you ascribe to Latour in a somewhat critical way, a force of argument? So I show you 2 things. They were made almost in the same year by 2 different architects. They are very similar. They're markings of letters and words on a page, organized around certain conventions of knowledge, dissemination, and production. One presented itself as art, and the other did not, although I show it to you, again, to borrow some of your vocabulary, framed in an art frame, shown in a museum with museum lighting. What are your thoughts about the difference between these 2 things?
Oh, the 2 that are here now. I thought you were about to unveil one.
No, these are 2 different things by 2 different people, made for 2 different reasons, defined in 2 different ways, although many details are otherwise the same.
Yes. here, I'm going to defend one of those old-fashioned positions I have to defend from time to time. I do think there is a distinct category of experience called aesthetic experience that is different from anything purely conceptual. That said, I don't think we always experience the same object as art or as non-art ourselves, let alone in comparison with other people. And so training can play a role, right? People can be trained to appreciate John Cage. People who just see it as noise at first can be trained to appreciate that. Our taste can mature and develop in order to appreciate a wider range of things. I remember as an 18-year-old not liking Picasso even. And reading about Picasso helped me like Picasso. And now it's an immediate experience for me now when I see Picasso. As for this, again, I think what makes beauty different, and the word beauty isn't even in fashion anymore, but I use it. What makes beauty different from other experiences is the tense relationship between the object and its qualities. So if I take an orange and spin the orange in my hand and look at it from different angles, that's what phenomenology talks about in philosophy. And that's not really an aesthetic experience. It's a theoretical experience. You're looking at all the possible qualities the orange has when you look at it from different angles. But then if Cézanne paints an orange, what's happening there is somehow the object is detached from its properties. Its properties seem to be both belonging to it and not belonging to it. And this is why I think incidentally that aesthetics is first philosophy, not epistemology or ethics or any of these others. Because I think ultimately what philosophy is about is the fact that things possess and do not possess their qualities at the same time. That's the predicament of the world, I think. That why is it that Socrates is never able to define justice or virtue or friendship? It's because, not because these things have infinite numbers of qualities, but because a thing's relation to its own qualities is ambiguous. He mentions this again when he talks about substance. His best definition of substance is something that can have different qualities at different times. Socrates can be happy today and sad tomorrow. He's still Socrates. And it seems so obvious that we forget how mysterious that is, that a thing can have ambivalent relation to these qualities, changing them, and they can change around without the thing itself changing, which is it's really quite remarkable when you think about it, that a thing doesn't have to always have the same properties. So then what is the thing? Because you think a thing is characterized by having certain properties. But sometimes a thing doesn't really have its properties, even though it seems to have them, because it can dispense with many of them.
But do you think that argument can give a thing qualities it didn't have?
It can teach people to see things they didn't see before.
But that's not what I asked.
Okay, what are you asking exactly?
Well, you just precluded knowledge as part of an aesthetic experience. I mean, you said it's different. The two things are different, in which case learning more about something shouldn't actually alter its aesthetic qualities.
No, I don't think it does. I don't think it takes away the mystery of the world and disenchants it when you learn something about it. So I didn't mean to give that impression. But that doesn't mean that the knowledge and the aesthetic experience aren't still distinct. Again, learning facts about an artist's biography or about the cultural conditions of the time can increase our appreciation very much. And it might be that we don't even understand the thing as art until that happens, until we've learned enough about what came before and what was coming after. But then when I think about something like Duchamp's ready-mades, I think a lot of the wrong lessons have been derived from that. I don't think those are just literal objects. I think they do work as art in some way, but it's precisely insofar as they're doing something a little different from what Duchamp and his followers think they're doing. It's not just that you're putting something in the gallery context and therefore it automatically becomes art. That's kind of what's going on. But if you make that statement, that's a banality, right? If I say anything can be art if you put it in a museum, that's kind of a banal statement. There might be some truth in it, but that is, in itself is not an aesthetic statement. He had to pull it off by choosing specific ready-mades. First of all, they had to be simple. If a piece were too complicated, you'd get lost in the details of the piece and you wouldn't think of it as a ready-made. You'd think that the object itself was trying to tell us something. So you have to have just the white urinal or the bottle rack or the bicycle wheel, geometrically simple shapes with simple color patterns and so forth. So imagine doing a urinal in Cubist painting style. I've written about that once. It would be just too intellectually busy. You'd be confused. Or imagine if Dali's paintings were done in a Cubist style. The only reason Dali can paint such complicated objects is because he's simply taking over uncriticized 19th century academic painting with three-dimensional landscape scenes and just putting weird objects in it. And then if you notice, the best Cubist paintings by Picasso and Braque are very simple objects, like violin, candlestick, because that allows them to draw attention to the technical complexity with which they are being depicted. So,
excuse me, could I just ask you,
sure.
What do you mean by like the best Braque and Picasso? I'm trying to understand how you make these judgments. I'm trying to feel comfortable with the references to a very canonic sense of your references are fairly canonical works of art. Mm-hmm. You've explained to us that it may require some education in order to appreciate an art object. I assume that you meant beyond the biography of this or that you meant something about what is a painting and the formalist discourse of medium. Mm-hmm. Every one of these things strikes me as more direct than indirect ways of describing the canon, actually fairly direct ways of describing the canon. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering how you would change if you would change your address to accommodate other kinds of objects made outside of the canon, perceived as art in other kinds of ways. I assume that you've gotten these questions before. How have you answered them?
I only chose canonical examples because I figured most of the audience is likely to know them. And of course, it always becomes harder when you're having to judge contemporary things. And I wouldn't call myself a connoisseur of contemporary arts. I call myself a connoisseur of contemporary philosophy. And I have my ideas about what's more significant and what's not. And we're always destined to be wrong about some of those judgments, but you have to take a risk. And yes, it's also important to open yourself to things you haven't liked traditionally, things that you find yourself resisting, whether it's certain styles, certain genres, certain artists. How do you know? I think we all build up our taste in any field through experience and through study. And there's never universal agreement on those, but you can come to a sort of approximate agreement. And of course, these sorts of canons always have to be open. Otherwise, they become dogma, right? You always have to be able to force new things into them. But I think there does have to be some notion of quality there. You can't simply take as a criterion that you agree with the politics of the artist, right? You might like the politics of a certain artist, but you have to admit that there may be artists or novelists whose politics you deplore who are still doing something aesthetically significant. Heidegger, a horrible person, not just a Nazi, but also a terrible person in his personal relations. I'm still willing to say that he's the most significant philosopher of the 20th century because he has certain achievements that anybody can use, that you can't go back to a time before he achieved those things. You can't go back to a pre-Heideggerian philosophy, in my opinion. And so that's the way that he's immunized against any of the, or most of these other factors. I mean, he becomes more and more an alarming figure the more we learn about him. As for the idea that the things I've said are all direct ways, well, yes and no, because yes, knowledge is always literal in a sense. Knowledge is always direct. But ultimately, for that to have any impact on how you're appreciating art or architectural works, you have to have the experience that backs it up. Otherwise, you're not really having an aesthetic experience. You've learned something about Neutra, you learned something about some other architect that you can communicate in conversation. But unless you're able to experience those buildings aesthetically as architectural works, it's not really an aesthetic experience. And I think that's not something that can be literal. You can't replace any aesthetic work with a prose description. You can try to make a prose description an artwork, right? Plenty of conceptual artists have done this, and those can succeed or fail. But there has to be something more going on than just statements, than just prose statements. So yes, I'm making a very absolute difference between the literal and the non-literal here. And I'm willing to defend that. Literal, oh, go ahead.
Well, I'm not attacking. I'm really trying to understand. And I'm when I said you are making direct statements, ancillary to your core argument about indirection are a series of direct statements. Picasso has good art and bad art. Right. This is art, this is not art. All of those things, I would say, are quite declarative and quite direct and would lead anybody listening to you to be able to make a distinction between a distinction, by the way, that I would feel completely incompetent to make. Right? I would not feel that I could say this is a bad Picasso and this is a good Picasso. I might guess what the market would say about those two things, but I would feel extremely uncomfortable entering into that kind of discourse. But you are making them in order, and one of the results of saying this is good, this is bad, this is art, this is not art, is a very select category of object remains in the center around which the argument is your argument about the artful object and indirection unfolds. And I'm not arguing against you. I just feel that it's important to lay that out, because I think that the argument works less well or more effectively in relation to certain kinds of objects that are already surrounded with the vibration, if you will, of these discourses about je ne sais quoi, about good and bad, about taste, and all of these kinds of things. So I'm actually agreeing with you in a strange way that the objects are fundamentally put to action in some way, but in part by the vibrations of the discourses that go around them. And those discourses have various kinds. Some of them can operate to make things art that haven't been art. Mm-hmm. Some things can reinforce the category. And I suppose my next question to you was just to have push the conversation even more sort of grotesquely into the political. I was wondering whether you thought if argument can change the ontological status of one thing from notes going to the library to a work of art, let's say, can argument also kill a work of art? Can it remove an object from its status as an art object? And if so, should it? And under what circumstances?
Sure, and it's happened many times. So if you read some of the classic formalist works of art criticism, like Clement Greenberg's, you're going to end up with a very bad opinion of surrealism unless you're pushing back against his understanding of what modern art should be. I happen to like surrealism. I think that's one of his biggest mistakes, is the low status he gives to Dali. But I want to draw a distinction here between being able to say whether something's good art or non-art and offering a provisional definition of what art is, because I'm more comfortable doing the second actually than the first. I didn't claim to know precisely which works of Picasso are the great ones and which are not. I would not consider myself enough of a connoisseur to necessarily do that. I have opinions. There are other people whose judgment I would trust more. But the fact that we are unsure of our ability to make those distinctions doesn't necessarily mean that those distinctions are meaningless. We can approximate those distinctions somehow. And I was going to ask you, since you said you wouldn't feel comfortable using these terms, there are a lot of value judgments in your writing about architecture, right? You can be very harsh about works that you don't like. Now, is that just because you feel more comfortable with that field? Why wouldn't you feel comfortable making those judgments about Picasso? Just because you don't feel like a specialist in Picasso, or?
No, I would need to have you give me an example, and particularly of when I made the assertion, because one of the great advantages of not being a philosopher is I get to change my mind all the time.
Oh, I do too.
And I very much think of making statements as tactical arguments in a particular context. Okay. So at certain moments, I felt it was necessary and useful to say certain kinds of things. And in other moments, I think it's necessary and useful to say other kinds of things. And I expected, I thought it would be possible, for example, you or somebody else, when presented with an image like this, might have said, no, this is not an image of art dying a necessary death. This is an image of something having been recognized to have always been pornography. This would have been the kind of thing that somebody might have said under some particular set of circumstances, like today. But I think of myself in the end as a historian, and therefore I think in very historical ways, and therefore I think of my judgments as historically circumscribed and not absolute.
I was thinking of your case that Neutra deserves to be reconsidered in comparison with Gropius and Mies is not necessarily a far inferior figure, which is not an uncontroversial statement, right? Early in the book, you're making the case for Neutra as more important than people think. You didn't mean that literally?
Yes, but saying that he's more important than people think, or that I see something interesting in him that hasn't been seen before, first of all, are not the same thing. And then thirdly, that's also not the same thing as making a comparative statement about Neutra versus Gropius. And moreover, it also depends in what specific context I was thinking, I was talking about. So that book was produced at a moment in which Neutra houses and the real estate market in Los Angeles had converged in an absolutely unexpected way. So up until that moment, a modernist house was thought to devalue the property that it sat on because the roof leaked and it did this and so forth. And according to that tradition, a Neutra house should have been nothing but a white elephant, as they had been for some time. And I was made extremely curious by the fact that at the very moment where these houses were beginning to crumble and therefore require the most amount of investment, they were resonating with some socio-psycho-aesthetic need that seemed to have emerged. And so I would have said my statement had much more to do with the 90s than it had anything to do with Neutra, really, in the end. And I would, if I were to write the book today, I'd probably write it in a very different way.
All right. I have some responses to that, but we've actually run out of time here. We're supposed to go to the Q&A room now, I think.
Okay.
Everyone who watched this, thank you.